I'm delighted that we can have today two panelists who are very much involved with the topic, or have been in their careers, of the topic of free speech. The first person who will be speaking is Martha Bayless, who is a professor of humanities at Boston College, has been a critic, writer, author, numerous publications, numerous titles, some of which she will refer to today in her talk. She will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're very fortunate to have responding to her Frederick Schauer, Professor Frederick Schauer, who's the David and May Harrison Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. He is a specialist in constitutional law. And one of the reasons he's here now is that many years ago, he wrote a book which Martha Bayless, among others, thinks is unsurpassable, titled Free Speech, A Philosophical Inquiry. She draws on it heavily in her own work on this subject. She is now working on a book on this subject. Of course, but the immediate occasion is an essay she's written for us called Taming the Furies, Free Speech in a Fractured Republic, which is part of her larger effort to examine more the perhaps lost norms that once, to some extent, mediated our actual practice of free speech in our republic. And of course, which have legal implications and legal ramifications, which Professor Schauer may be getting into to some extent, but I don't presume to know how he will respond to Martha's presentation. But I welcome both of them to this panel discussion, and I'm delighted to have both of you here. Martha, would you go?
Sure. Well, thank you, Jay. I'd like to say hello to all the invisible Zoomans out there who may have tuned in. It's very weird to talk to people without seeing them, but that's the way it is. I'd like to thank you, Jay, and everyone at the Institute for this, hosting this event. If James is there, if Ryan is there, if John Owen is there, I'll thank them and say hello to them. I'd like to thank Kelly for her practical arrangements and her savvy. And if Leanne is out there, I'd like to thank her and say hello for her editorial help. And whoever else I've forgotten, thank you too. I've already said to Professor Schauer, I'll call him Fred Schauer, that I am honored to meet him. This is the first time I've met him because his work on defining the various justifications that we have for free speech in our society was very, very eye-opening and inspirational to me. So I'm really tickled to meet him. I'm going to start with a quick glance at the current landscape and compare two things that don't normally get compared. The first is the, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but earlier this month, 14 people went on trial. Well, 11 out of 14 people went on trial for aiding and abetting the attacks on the French satirical magazine, Charlie Hebdo. That attack occurred in January of 2015. And the total of, I think, 23 people were killed in the process of 3 days. And 11 or 12 of those people were Charlie Hebdo editors and staff. There was a huge demonstration after that, 3 million people in the streets of Paris with t-shirts and signs saying, "Je suis Charlie," I am Charlie, identifying their defense of free speech with that particular magazine. Then I would ask you to cast your eye in a very different direction and look at some of the latest rallies being held by President Trump, which have been held in indoor spaces without the appropriate masks and social distancing and all the rest. and in a kind of defiance of what are taken to be public health truth and regulation about handling this pandemic we're in. Now, what do these have in common? I would say, it's a bit of a stretch, but I'll start with it, that they both embrace a rather extreme libertarian view of free speech. That free speech, no matter how offensive or how outrageous, we have a right to express ourselves. It's our sacred liberty to express ourselves however we wish, and nobody's going to tell us what we can't say and what we can't do. And beyond that, there's a kind of impulse in both cases, and I'm talking about Charlie Hebdo, the magazine itself, to push the envelope as much as possible. And there's a history with Charlie Hebdo. They've been insulting religious people for quite a long time, and insulting politicians and everybody else in every conceivable way. That's what they do. Their insults about Muslims and Islam actually escalated from 2011 to 2013 and 14, where instead of just being satirical and engaging in various forms of what Muslims would consider to be blasphemy, by 2014, they had added in sexual obscenity, very obscene drawings of the prophet, really pornographic drawings of the prophet and so forth. Believe me, I'm not saying this justifies what happened, but there's a tendency in this way of looking at free speech to constantly be pushing out the boundaries. It's a cultural tendency, and you see it in that instance. And obviously you see it in Trump supporters who they don't just not wear a mask, they also sort of defiantly will get in your face and shout at you and get very angry and spray as many respiratory droplets as they can in an effort to assert their liberties. Now, this may seem like a bizarre comparison, and there's very few other things that these two instances have in common. But I do think they have in common this idea of free speech as it's not really sincere unless it's somehow transgressive. And that people who really believe in free speech will defend the most transgressive and the most offensive speech to prove that you really are in favor of free speech. That's a real spirit of our age. And I could say more about that. Then I go in my article to the other extreme, which is now it's called the cancel culture. It's had about 3 or 4 other names before that, of a kind of thought policing that began in the academy. There's some interesting books recently written about the origins of it. It's become more and more aggressive way of sort of shutting down speech that is politically unacceptable or considered to be harmful in the sense of somehow bordering on hate speech or offending or upsetting the sensibilities of marginalized people of various categories. I gave an example in the article of University of Southern California professor who read to his class or had his class read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And that was caused a great reaction that this was a greatly offensive thing for him to have done, because that letter includes 2 instances of the N-word, the little N-word, not the big N-word, not the capital letter N-word, but the little one, both of which are now apparently offensive. So that's just one of thousands of instances of cancel culture operating on the campus, and now it has extended beyond the campus, I think following the basic path that was carved out by the Me Too movement into all sorts of institutions and organizations in our society where people feel quite justified in shutting down what they consider to be offensive speech. So we have 2 extremes. We have this kind of transgressive, pushing the envelope, libertarian, and it's not just on the right or the left, it's on both. And then at the other extreme, we have an attempt, a sort of heavy-handed attempt to sort of shut down that which is not acceptable according to a certain narrow definition. So we're in a kind of a pickle. I would quote this is where I want to quote Fred Schauer, an article he wrote in the Washington Post, I think it was, after the Charlottesville demonstrations a few years ago. It's just a nice line. He said, as the opposing parties hurl hackneyed slogans at each other, we find little serious public thought about the values of freedom of speech and the qualifications that should be imposed on it. I really like that word qualifications because it suggests a kind of something other than referring to censorship or thought policing or silencing. It's a sense that free speech has always been tempered, it's been limited, it's been controlled in various ways by every single human society. And the question really is, given that fact, why are some societies freer than others? Why do some societies actually enjoy a great deal of freedom of speech with some limits, and others have no freedom of speech? So it's not just the existence of limits, it's the kind of limits and how they're imposed. So I have a 5-part description of my account of various ways of limiting speech. I can go into it. I think maybe I won't go into it all now. It's basically, the first 2 ways have to do with living in an authoritarian society, authoritarian regime, where people are forced to be silent about certain things, and they respond to that by self-censoring. To me, the word self-censorship means you are remaining silent out of fear, because there will be untoward consequences if you dare to dissent or to speak. And then the second pair are sort of belong more in a relatively liberal democratic society, where a government that respects the rule of law and the rights of its citizens imposes certain rules on certain media in certain ways. And because this is apparently, arrived at by democratic processes, it's a kind of legitimate limiting of speech, politically legitimate. And so institutions and organizations will cooperate with those rules. My example that I give is the FCC regulation of broadcast media, beginning in the 30s and ending pretty much in the 80s when the Reagan administration lifted a lot of those regulations. No one found that to be, some people found it to be very offensive, but most people did not regard that as illegitimate censorship. And then the fifth one is the one that I really think is worthy of attention and doesn't get enough attention. And that is what I call voluntary restraint, for lack of a better phrase. That one I'll read to you. Practiced by individuals and communities that, in the absence of government pressure, are free to shape and enforce their own speech norms. Now, the example I would give of this actually is not in my article, because I just came across it. It's from Charlie Hebdo. And when the trial began earlier this month, I saw a headline that said Charlie Hebdo had reprinted the offending cartoons in an effort to sort of assert their commitment to free speech. But I dug into it a little bit more, and I found out that the offending cartoons they had reprinted were actually the Danish cartoons from 2005, which were not obscene. They might have been regarded as blasphemous by devout Muslims, but they weren't anything like what Charlie Hebdo was putting up there in 2014. So here's Charlie Hebdo exerting a certain voluntary restraint and walking back, I think, a little bit from what they had done before. I have no problem with that. Some people might accuse them of cowardice, but I think I understand why they tempered that a bit. I do think they shouldn't claim that they're running the same cartoons that caused that provoked the violent reaction, but I'll leave it at that. Okay, so I think I'm probably running out of time. That's how I frame my article. I then, just to quickly run through it, I try to look at the ways, how did this happen? And I look at that through what amounts to our public forum in the United States, and that is our media, broadly construed. And the article looks at two aspects of our media. The first is popular culture, which is something I've written about a great deal. And there I trace a shift through looking at popular music in particular, a shift from a performance style that I associate with more traditional popular music in America, which comes out of the African-American culture. It's a style of performance where the performer is expressing the emotions of the audience. And there's a kind of sense of if you will, a beloved community. The singer or the performer is expressing a communal emotion. That was the dominant style of performance in our popular music for many, many years. But in the late 60s, like everything else, it changed. And in many ways, at different points, there was a shift to what I would call the avant-garde European shocking the audience, the artist as a rebellious, in revolt against society, in revolt against the repressions of society, and angry and shocking and trying to upset the audience. And that's pretty much the dominant style of a lot of our popular culture now. I just traced it through 4 different Woodstocks, but you can trace it in other ways. And then shift, taking off my culture hat, putting on my journalistic politics hat, I talk about the changes in media regulation, and that has led, beginning in the 80s, to the repeal of the FCC regulations that sort of required broadcast outlets to cover, the language is, I can quote you the language, hold on a second, to every licensed broadcaster, this is back in the days of broadcasting, I understand the media have changed. Every broadcaster to obtain a license had to serve community needs, devote a set amount of airtime to covering controversial public affairs, and to do so in a manner that included contrasting views. That was known as the Fairness Doctrine. And in the 80s, the Fairness Doctrine was repealed for various reasons under the Reagan administration. And right after it was repealed, Rush Limbaugh took to the airwaves, and you had a proliferation of talk radio, which was not news, and it was not fair-minded, it was not balanced, it was opinion. And that seemed like a good thing at the time. A lot of people thought that was great. Well, we can see that it's led in a commercial, profit-minded media environment to what we have today, which is beyond opinion. It's just, you know, the ranting and raving of our media on both sides has become rather toxic, as everyone knows. Last part, I end up talking about the internet. I should probably put that on hold. I don't think this audience needs me to tell them what's been going on with Facebook and Google and Twitter and the internet, and how that has been putting fuel on the flames of this angry culture that we already had, and has been sort of taken what we had, the problem that we had, and made it worse, I would argue. And the challenge of governing that in a world where, as one media researcher has put it, the First Amendment is just a local ordinance, because the internet, of course, does not respect national boundaries in many ways. And so it's very hard to think about how to govern, how to limit the internet, no matter how reasonably we might think about it. The practical challenge of doing it is pretty enormous. But that's sort of where I end up. I do have references to the Furies throughout my article, but I decided not to talk too much about the Furies. So I'll stop there after 20 minutes. I hope that's not too long.
So I'm delighted to have been asked to participate in this event, in part because it gave me the opportunity to read Martha's wonderful article that displays an enormous amount of erudition about music, about classics, and about popular culture, three subjects about which I know, to a first approximation, nothing. I am inclined to agree with her, actually not just inclined, I agree with her that we are now seeing extremes in both directions. I'm not sure that Charlie Hebdo is the best example of that. It's not clear to me that 3 million people would have marched if the followers of Jean Le Pen had murdered the employees of an Arab language newspaper. Moreover, France seems, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, an odd example to use in terms of an absolute view on issues of defamation, on issues of insult, on issues of the right to privacy. France, even by the standards of Western Europe, even by the standards of liberal industrialized democracies, tends to be more speech restrictive than most. I think the Charlie Hebdo example is an odd one, but the basic point is right. She's right that in one side we see a particularly extreme version of free speech advocacy. I'm not sure I'd use the word absolutism, but certainly an extreme version of free speech advocacy, free speech law. And indeed, at that extreme, we find the US, that American First Amendment doctrine is exceptional, not just by the standards of North Korea, Zimbabwe, and Saudi Arabia, but by the standards of the industrialized liberal democracies of Western Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, New Zealand, add to the list, and so on. The US is a speech protective outlier in a number of ways. One of the more obvious is defamation, that is libel and slander. Since the Supreme Court's 1964 decision in New York Times versus Sullivan, libel actions are unavailable for public officials and public figures about whom false things are said, unless they can prove by clear and convincing evidence not only that it was false, but that the publisher knew it was false at the time of publication. That's an impossible burden of proof, and basically the libel action has come close to disappearing from American public life in ways that it has not in any of the liberal democracies I've just mentioned. So too with respect to actions for invasion of privacy, so too with the publication of illegally obtained documents. The Pentagon Papers case that of 1971 is iconic, but the right to publish that which originally has been obtained unlawfully sets the US apart from other liberal democracies. And most recently, and I will return to this, the US is a very extreme outlier in its willingness to use the First Amendment to protect a range of commercial communications, advertising communications, and the like, where if free speech arguments were raised in other countries, the response would be something to the order of, huh? But in the US, and I will return to this, the First Amendment increasingly is taken to protect a range of commercial practices that nobody would have thought half a century ago, to say nothing about 1791, had anything to do with the idea of free speech. Now, that's one extreme. I think Martha is also right that the other extreme these days comes less from government, but from non-governmental social pressure. Indeed, one of the interesting but forgotten dimensions of John Stuart Mill's iconic On Liberty is that he talks a great deal about social intolerance. Mill is now commonly taken to be the standard reference against governmental censorship, but his discussion of social intolerance is just as important, and these days, maybe even more so. Now, Mill uses the word intolerance, but that raises a question for me, a somewhat larger question. Why should we tolerate that which is harmful? So I worry at times that we use the word offense to denigrate what somebody else would think of as a harm. That's agnostic about whether certain forms of speech do or do not harm, but typically the word offense is used by those who want to downplay what somebody else thinks of as a harm. But the larger question then is, if there are things that are linguistic, verbal, written, printed, broadcast, and so on that are harmful, and then we can talk about what they might be and how they might be harmful, and so on, then we can ask the question, why should they be tolerated? So tolerance sounds like a good thing. Sometimes. Some of you, not me, now have or have had in the past children. And I, at least recalling what my parents would have said to me with respect to certain forms of unacceptable behavior, I'm not going to tolerate that. So we should ask the question whether, when, and how we should tolerate harmful activities in general or harmful speech in general. That, again, raises the question. We treat the First Amendment as iconic. We treat free speech as almost an argument-stopping observation. One of the things I find a little bit troubling about much of the free speech discourse and scholarship until recently is that there's been far less free speech about free speech than free speech encourages us to have about everything else. I think that's changing, and I think that's a good thing, regardless of how you come out on some of the modern examples, regardless of how you come out on things like hate speech or the feminist anti-pornography movement or whatever. All of these movements have at least encouraged us to speak freely about free speech. And if free speech is a good thing because it encourages us to consider a wide range of ideas, then we ought to consider a wide range of ideas about free speech, which until recently, and especially in journalistic and academic and related circles, has tended not to exist. And maybe one of the things that the current so-called cancel culture has encouraged us to think about, because that's what at least some of the cancelers believe, is what's so good about free speech? Why should we have free speech? If there is a form of speech that is genuinely harmful, Why should it be protected? There are responses to that, and there are discussions to have both about why harmful speech should be protected and whether certain forms of speech are or are not harmful. But the cancel culture is not, in at least some of its versions, is saying, don't talk to me about free speech. That's not so important. There are other things that are more important. And that may be right, it may be wrong, but that's something that's worth talking about rather than taking their skepticism, the canceller's skepticism about free speech itself, as not worth a response. Now, let me just say a little bit in the few minutes that remain, and it comes out of this discussion, a little bit about the changing politics of free speech in the US. So when I first became aware of the free speech culture and law in the US, and even earlier, free speech was largely, and the First Amendment was largely the weapon of, or at least the province of the political left. Whether it be opposition to restrictions on obscene publications, or opposition to restrictions on socialists, communists, syndicalists, and various other left-wing-ists, or whether it be opposition to restrictions on labor unions, and then a little bit later, protection of civil rights protesters, largely in the 1960s, when much of the free speech civil rights argumentation developed, and then protection of anti-Vietnam War protesters. For all this period, let's say from at least the post-World War II period up until the mid to late 1970s, free speech was largely the argument of and the province of the political left. Things are now dramatically different. If you look at recent Supreme Court cases, you will discover that the justices most commonly, whether correctly or not, most commonly characterized as conservatives are the ones most likely to be in the majority on free speech protective, First Amendment protective decisions. Outside of the Supreme Court, we see much the same thing. And much of this, to go back to what I was talking about before, is manifested in questions about commercial speech and commercial advertising. That as an extension of the deregulatory program that started with the Reagan administration and included the FCC abandonment of the fairness doctrine that Martha's talked about, we've seen the First Amendment used as a weapon against the regulation of securities sales, labor law, antitrust laws. People with a straight face are arguing that the federal government requirement that employers post the regulations about minimum wage and workplace safety in the workplace are a violation of the employer's free speech rights, and that's hardly atypical. We see this also with respect to issues of cigarette advertising, alcohol advertising, opposition to the feminist anti-pornography movement, opposition to hate speech. This is a rather grab bag of different issues, but on all of those, campaign finance as well, on almost all of those, The arguments for First Amendment protection are coming from the political right, and the arguments for restriction are coming from the political left. The polar opposite of what we saw from the 40s through the 70s. Why that is a very difficult and complex question. Those on the right would say it just shows that liberals are hypocrites, and that they were willing to protect their friends with the occasional nod to inconsequential, or so it was thought at the time, inconsequential crazies, whether they be neo-Nazis or the Ku Klux Klan, but largely they were interested in protecting their friends, and now it's turned out that they are seen to be the hypocrites that they are. On the other side, a common response to all of that would be that given that almost all human activity, and certainly almost all of human activity that is subject to some form of regulation, involves words or language in some form. Conservatives are latching onto this coincidence to basically use the First Amendment to serve a general anti-government, anti-regulatory agenda. Who is right in all of this, I will leave to others to think about, and I will stop at that. Thank you.
Unmute. Yes, thank you both very much. It's, I think, my prerogative to ask the first question, then we'll turn to the larger group. But I just wonder about this fairness doctrine question, and I want to ask both Martha and Fred this: is the inability to address the fairness doctrine's applicability to subscription services, is that one of those areas related to free speech that have become virtually taboo, or that they can't be addressable because of other reasons? I guess, Fred, that's a question maybe more to you, but also Martha could weigh in as well.
Okay, so let me give a technical answer to that, and then a slightly larger non-technical answer. The technical answer is that in 1969, when the Supreme Court upheld the fairness doctrine and related FCC principles against free speech objections, it did so by saying that regulation is necessary because of scarcity in broadcast bans. So the justification for treating broadcasting differently was the idea that there was a necessary technological scarcity. And for those of us, there are not very many of us, I suspect, as part of this call, who remember 1969 and who remember that TV stations consisted of, depending on where you live, channels 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 11, and 13, and that was about it. The scarcity rationale justified upholding the fairness doctrine. One of the things that emerged out of that is that the fairness doctrine was held to be inapplicable to various forms of communication that were not technologically scarce. That included most obviously newspapers, but it also then included cable television, and it includes a whole bunch of other things now. So the original idea was, of course, you can't have a fairness doctrine for the media in general, but the fairness doctrine for broadcast was an exception for technological reasons. So the default still remains, it's unacceptable under First Amendment doctrine, and here the U.S. is probably not as much, very much of an outlier. It's unacceptable as a matter of free speech principles for the government to impose obligations of fairness or balance on privately owned media. So there have long been arguments the other way. In an odd way, those were arguments that were stronger a few decades ago, when even outside of broadcasting, a few publications dominated the media environment. So in 1975, it would have been a plausible argument to say the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and a few others so dominate the media environment that there ought to be either mandatory access to those outlets or an obligation of fairness imposed on them. Given technological changes since then, it's hard to say that there are particular publications that have the same kind of dominance. I'll let others decide whether Facebook and the like are the equivalent. Those of us who remember when there were only 6 TV stations are not the ones to talk about the technological and sociological dimensions of Facebook, but that's the sort of doctrinal answer. I'll stop at that.
Martha, would you like to jump in on that, or would you like to wait for another question? Can we unmute Martha?
I just unmuted myself, I think. Okay. I would add a couple of things to that. My first reaction to the last part of what Fred said is that I don't think it hasn't been since before Gutenberg that print was considered a scarce resource. So I don't think, in the lack of medieval monks writing out manuscripts, that print, you could ever use that argument for print. And it was certainly never used in the American context, where print was expressly protected by the First Amendment. I'd be very surprised, even if there had been 2 newspapers in the country, that it would have been possible to impose that kind of control. The control that was made of broadcasters, it's true, there was a technological justification, but there was also a kind of political cultural explanation. Every single country in the world, when radio and television came along, starting with radio, every single country in the world except the United States immediately placed that new medium under government control. Every single country, it was state media that took upon the broadcasting as a state function. And that is why most countries in the world today still have a very robust public broadcasting system. In the US, as we know, it was all privately owned from the beginning in the early days of radio. And it was a Wild West scene, a little bit like the internet until 10 years, 15 years ago. And so the US government decided for various reasons that radio was a dangerous medium. In addition to being a scarce resource, the radio was dangerous. You had the experience of World War II and Hitler's use of the radio for propaganda purposes. And there were a number of other reasons besides just the scarcity one for the US government taking the unusual step of regulating expression and regulating media. That was the first thing I would say. And Fred's totally right that the first pushback against all that came from the left. Long before we had Rush Limbaugh, we had George Carlin with his 7 dirty words, which was a poke in the eye of the FCC. He lost the battle, but he won the war in that respect.
Martha, could we
Yeah.
invite some outsiders in before we run out of time?
No, I'm just going to talk the whole time, right?
Okay, all right.
Okay.
I think I see John Owen has his hand raised. John, welcome.
Hi. Oh, hi. Yes, Martha, Fred, terrific. Thank you very much. My question is probably more to Martha. Some of us are attached to the idea of maximal freedom of speech, or let's say something close to maximal. I can't be too precise. But at the same time, societal norms of, I'll call them decency or civility, so that people, that is to say, a regime that trusts people and groups of people to restrain themselves, to have a sense of decorum, to have a sense of harm and offense. I'm wondering if Martha thinks that's just impossible to have those two things. In other words, we can separate analytically, as I think Martha does, the legal regime over speech from the societal norms. But in practice, is that separation just not hold up? Is there a causal relationship? Because you yourself, Martha, talk about changes in the law, the elimination of the fairness doctrine for broadcasting, which leads to Rush Limbaugh and so on. So are those of us who are attached to that notion we can have both of those good things simply wrong, at least in the current media environment? Thanks.
Well, I have to point out to my students sometimes that the US has practiced a great deal of censorship, not just of television and radio, but of books and art and theater and film on the basis of public morality. Banned in Boston, I guess Fred knows about that, according to something he said earlier. Boston was famous, of course, for its local censorship of various forms of expression because of its religious history and so forth. So the US has always been quite free to censor things on a moral basis. And of course, the great book about this was by Harry Clore, the late Harry Clore, who taught political theory at Kenyon College. He was a wonderful man. We've had moral censorship for a long time, and then it eroded in various stages. A number of court cases, obviously, through the middle of the century. And then it just went from there through the media and through the rest of the culture to the point where the idea of, censorship on the basis of sexual morality, obscenity, or violence or encouragement of criminality, all those old things that used to be in the film industry's production code, to cite one example, do seem to have been pretty well blasted out so that they just don't hold anymore. If we were in the same media environment technologically as we were 25, 30 years ago, maybe we could think about, on a national basis, finding some kind of consensus about where there should be some limits. I think that's a bit unlikely, but let's say we wanted to. I think the technology really has made it a whole different ballgame. Even the existing restraints that still are out there, like ratings on movies, which are still done by the Motion Picture Association. They still rate their films. But ask anybody under the age of 50 and they will tell you that this is virtually meaningless. And it's not as if Hollywood were against censorship, because Hollywood, as we all know now, censors very heavily what it exports to China, but not according to the values of the United States, but according to the values of the Chinese Communist Party in order to get into that market. So there's all sorts of weird censorship going on in the entertainment industry for all sorts of reasons. But the only government that's directing any of it is really the Chinese government at the moment. I know that sounds outrageous, but it's true. So I don't know, I'm rambling a bit. We would have to have the political will, and I think we're a long way from that. And then we would have to figure out how to do it in the current media environment. And I think we're even longer away from that. So I would just leave it at that.
Fred, did you have anything to add?
Thank you. Helpful. Yeah.
Fred, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, let me just add an anecdote in support of that. Again, an anecdote that goes back a long way. In 1969, a young man named Paul Cohen, who objected to the war in Vietnam, objected to the draft, objected to the selective service system, objected to the policies of General Hershey, who was head of the selective service system, decided to object in public. You can't fit all that I have just said on the back of a jacket. So he wore a jacket outside of the Los Angeles County Courthouse saying, "Fuck the draft." In response, he was cited for disturbing the peace. Case went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld his right to object to government policy by saying, "Fuck the draft." The case was duly reported in the New York Times the next day, which did not include and would not have included the word that Paul Cohen was constitutionally entitled to use. So the case was thought important enough to report on by the Times, but the Times, and in an act of self-censorship, didn't use the word. And we see lots of examples of this, whether it be social intolerance or market pressure or whatever. There are lots of forces other than the risk of government imprisonment or government fines that influence who says what. And it seems to me that one of the virtues of what Martha is talking about is that we need more attention to that, especially given the current state of First Amendment doctrine, in which most forms of direct government restriction are impermissible.
Say something in response?
Yes,
Yes.
but yeah, if you could make it quickly so I could bring in a question.
I would just say that the New York Times not publishing that word is I would define that as voluntary restraint, not self-censorship, because it's not doing it under the shadow of a censorious regime. And there's a lot of examples of that. Randy Kennedy at the Harvard Law School wrote a book back 10 years ago with the title was the N-word was the title. And it's a history of how that word got sort of muted in American culture without any laws being passed, anybody being sent to prison, or anybody being fined for using it. It's a very interesting little book. I don't know if he could publish it today, but that's another question. Okay.
Bob Cochran is on with a question.
Hi, this is Bob Cochran. Just retired from Pepperdine and now have settled in Charlottesville. I'll tell just a really short vignette. I went to the murder trial of James Fields, who was charged with murdering Heather Heyer in Charlottesville in the famous protest. And when I got there, the courtroom was divided up into the supporters of Heather Heyer, who packed one side of the court, the prosecution side, and then the other side had just a few folks, and I wound up sitting over there. And I wound up sitting next to a young man who it turns out was a truck driver who'd driven from West Virginia for the protest, and now he'd driven down for the trial. And he was a little rough-hewn around the edges, but I thought, well, this would be interesting. And so we chatted a bit. And then at one point he said, I missed the day when you could hear serious discussion of issues on TV from people like William F. Buckley and Dick Cavett. And I was so surprised that this guy would even know who the two of them were. And I thought back to how much I enjoyed those shows myself and how I just haven't been able to find a show like that any longer. I used to enjoy Paul Gigot and Mark Shields and their discussions of PBS on Fridays, but now Paul Gigot has his own Wall Street Journal report on Fox News. Mark Shields is coupled with David Brooks, and you never see them disagree on things. There's just not interaction between these two shows. Any thoughts on why there doesn't seem to be intelligent, thoughtful discussion even on PBS, where I used to be able to get it with very interesting panels?
In relation to free speech, okay?
Well, I
Who
think
first? Martha.
I agree with you about PBS, and I do it with reluctance because I've often defended PBS against some of my conservative friends who say it's all biased. I mean, I think it's done some wonderful things that were not. The series on Vietnam that came out recently would be an example. I'm a little concerned about the NewsHour. It depends on the topic. They've gotten very politically tendentious on domestic politics, I'm sorry to say. I think you can find those things, but it's like you suggest, they're niches. You have to know where to look. You have to be on Blogging Heads or find somebody that you like to hear debate things online. And it's available, but it's available for a kind of proactive media using, knowledge seeking class of people in the United States. And I think one of the effects of all these changes in our media have been to create a have and have not. And it's not just people being online or not. It's a have and have not in the sense of the sources of information and the richness of the media environment in terms of getting the kind of thing you're talking about. I think the people who are listening to this know how to do it and can find it if they know where to look. But a lot of people are stuck with very tendentious, very polarizing cable TV, and they're kind of lost in the wilderness of these two extremes, and it's really unfortunate. And that is something that regulation used to handle, and that in the digital age, it's not clear how we're going to govern that or pull that into some kind of more human shape than it's in now.
There's an interesting question about whether this phenomenon, which clearly exists, is supply driven or demand driven. There is a considerable amount of research over the last 10 or 15 years that indicates that people use the media, and I use the word use advisedly, use the media largely to reinforce their antecedent views. That is, you don't find people on the left seeking out the Weekly Standard. You don't find people on the right seeking out The Nation to take to politically oriented news magazines. We see the same thing, radio, television, newspapers, and so on. We need the psychologists here to explain the phenomenon, but the phenomenon is clearly right. It clearly exists, been well documented. The users want reinforcement of their views. They don't want their own views challenged. They don't want to see the other views. They love those forms of media that pat them on the back and say, you're right. Whether we should blame the media for this or not, again, relates to the question, is this supply driven or demand driven? Back a long time ago, this was a debate that existed about cars. Do people want a certain kind of car, or does Ford and General Motors and Chrysler, back when those were the only major sources of cars, are they telling people what they ought to want rather than listening to people about what they do want? Same thing with the media.
I don't want to give away all the juicy bits of Martha's essay, but I think she has a very good discussion of Jaron Lanier's book on dealing with this whole supply-demand question, but just the fact that, you know, his book is titled 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts.
Yeah, I was going to comment about that. I think what Fred says is, of course, has been true for a long time, but then you have to take into consideration, well, first of all, the power of the social media platforms, in particular, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, have a business model that is not interested in entertaining you or informing you or corrupting your soul, for that matter. It's interested in gathering data on you and then crunching that data in tetrabytes and ultra tetrabytes, whatever comes after tetrabytes, and selling it to the highest bidder. So it's not really interested in supplying what you demand or listening to you. It's interested in making use of your data. And Jaron Lanier is one of the more entertaining writers on the topic, but there are plenty of people talking about this. So here we run into, I think, what's something I'd just like to mention at the end, because we're coming up on the end, I guess. Well, I guess we're not quite yet. We have some time, which is I've mentioned it before, the problem of governance when the companies that are now, I'll give you an example. Facebook, when after the 2016 election, when people began to complain about the filter bubble effect, you know, that the algorithms are giving you not just more hats to buy, but also more right-wing websites, because you liked the right-wing website last week, so now we're going to give you a whole bunch more. You bought a hat last week, so here's some more ads for hats. It's the same type of algorithm. Or a left-wing website, of course. That creates what is called a filter bubble, where we get more and more of what we've liked before. And that's a way of keeping us online, keeping us attached to the platform so that they can enjoy getting our data off of us. That's a bad description of the dynamic, but I think most of your listeners probably understand it perfectly well. But Facebook took it upon itself to enrich people's ideological news feeds, and they put in a program that would actually send you every now and then, you could opt into this, send you every now and then, if you're on the left, they'll send you a conservative or a right-wing bit of news or commentary. And it sort of was, you know, if you've always been wearing blue, here's something red. Think of wearing this, you know, sort of throwing it in every now and then. This was supposed to be a corrective. I think it was basically laughed out of the room, and they stopped doing it. But why I bring it up, because the power of Facebook to unwillingly, but to feel pressure to take on these responsibilities of being some kind of a gatekeeper of political discourse, not just in the United States, but in large parts of the world, is just, it's a bizarre situation that a company like that, whose business model has nothing to do with all that, should be held responsible for the quality of public discourse. This is where we get into really deep waters, because I've been reading a lot about internet governance, and I think it's a very, very challenging topic. I don't have the answer, but it could go in either of two directions. One direction is somehow we will all become part of a centrally administered, centrally controlled system of surveillance, information propaganda, and censorship, the way that the Chinese intranet has developed. They will have a global system. That's one horrific nightmare that you could have. The other is that we will have what are called walled gardens, or a splinter net, where the West somehow gets together and builds a bubble around its internet, so that within that bubble we can all freely exchange information like we did in the early days of the internet, and not worry too much about it. And I guess I'm still talking. Okay. And I'm just trying to raise a big and thorny topic here at the end, and I think I've probably raised enough of it that I should let others address it or ask questions.
It is
Fred, were you?
just an image to reinforce all of this. If you look at much of the historical free speech literature, by which I mean 1950 and earlier, the classic image is Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park, London. If you go to Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park, London now, you will discover that all of the speakers are crackpots and all of the listeners are tourists. It's an image that may suggest that there is not really very much opportunity these days for what we think of as the marketplace of ideas. That is a place where there's genuine discussion, deliberation, or at least hearing things that are different from what you now believe. And that's troubling. Indeed, one of the, there are lots of things that are not so nice about American law schools. One of the nice things about American law schools is that given that we are training lawyers, it has become, at least for most of us, perfectly acceptable to ask a student to say, what do you think is the strongest argument against your own position? Because in a courtroom, there's going to be someone who's going to make that argument. And to be a good lawyer, you have to know in advance what that argument is going to be. The law school training students to be advocates, good advocates who anticipate the best arguments against their own way, against their own position, is not a bad intellectual training ground when done best for the not necessarily lawyer-like discipline of intellectual honesty. What's the strongest argument against your own position? And don't just pick the best target out there. What do you think is the strongest argument? If there isn't somebody out there making it, what do you think the strongest argument is? And then what do you think the strongest argument is against that? We don't have much of it these days.
And John Stuart Mill calls for that in chapter 2. He calls for, you can't really hold a position, chapter 2 of On Liberty, you can't hold a position unless you can make the case against your own position better than your opponent can.
Right.
Then you really hold a position.
Right.
He's pretty good on that topic.
We see, interestingly, there are exceptions to this, but somewhat commonly in many mass media outlets, when they want to act as if they are being fair to the other side, they pick the best target from the other side rather than the person from the other side who will make the best argument.
We have another question from abroad, or not so far abroad, from Joe Davis.
Hi there.
Joe?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. I had a question for Martha about the common culture, the decline of a kind of common culture. It's in the article, and certainly the fifth point in terms of sort of constraints on free speech is the voluntary, which seems to suggest a kind of common culture or a common set of norms and so on. And a lot of that has really been lost. And I wonder if you have some thought. It strikes me as you know, apart from a kind of full-blown fracturing of society and all the consequences that might have even further on our politics and so on, that we need some revival of a common culture, a common set of norms and so on. I wondered if you had ideas about how we might do that. How is there a way forward in terms of the kind of voluntary constraint? We can always create more laws and so on, but But we know those are crude instruments, and it's better when a free people, right, are able to make decisions and constrain themselves. Anyway, so I wonder if you have any reflections on that, on our common culture.
I wish if I had the solution, I would have let you know before this. I think we're in a very stormy, unsettled time with regard to that. It may be that the strains that we're going through right now will end up resulting in some kind of new consensus. Just to take one area of, say, political discourse, public political discourse. Maybe we'll find our way back to something that people can find that is less rancorous and often. One thing Americans agree on is that they're really tired of all this mudslinging and brickbat throwing and so forth. They want most of them want the other side to stop. But I don't know. I mean, there's so many different ways I could take that question. It's obviously a huge question. The passages in the essay I wrote about the voluntary restraint and informal norms, I compare it to the connective tissue in the body, that it's something that holds everything together. And it varies, some of it is soft and flexible and some of it is rather rigid, but it's what holds the whole thing together. I don't think our regime of laws and liberties as formally constituted would survive without that connective tissue. And I think the founders knew that perfectly well, which is they had read their classical Republican texts and they all believed in public virtue and public morality, that self-governance isn't possible by people who can't govern themselves, and so forth and so on. So I understand the problem. I do think that our media are completely irresponsible at the moment, and in ways that need to be curbed. I just don't know where the curbing is going to come from, and I fear that it will be too severe and amount to a kind of backlash and repression rather than something that's reasonable. So I've probably made you feel worse, but I don't have a very upbeat answer to that question. That's a very good question. I don't have a good upbeat answer to it now.
Nor do I.
Except maybe that I think people are aware of it. I think people are more conscious of this problem than they were a few years ago. Maybe that's a good thing.
I think one of the areas we talk about the violent language, the pornographic, the offensive language, but I think one of the interesting questions in a free speech regime is truthfulness of speech, and attempts now by some of the online organizations to basically rate in a way, or to register certain postings as truthful or being untruthful, or being, there's no factual basis behind. But again, this will raise the question of what is the authority of the rater? And what I think Joe, and Martha and Fred are talking about is what sort of authority right now has any kind of binding power in a republic, and possibly a whole West, and possibly the whole world, that is radically fractured, where different conceptions of reality and truth are regnant. I mean, the discussion of conspiracy theories that has become quite hot in the scholarly world and also in the media. The Atlantic, I think, did a very good piece on QAnon several months ago, where you're really talking about a radical hoving off of realities, and what that means, what that implies for a reasonable free speech regime, among other things, is pretty dire in some ways. And I don't know how we restore a sense of a broadly respected authority anymore. I mean, science is on the ropes with many people, and certainly religion and even strong philosophical schools are struggling. So, I mean,
Very, very quickly.
I would share, I think I'm saying I share the pessimism. I don't know whether others,
very-
what do you think about truth ratings, Fred?
Very quickly, I would say there's two writers that I would recommend who are really good on this. One is next to me on the screen. I recently read an article by Fred in the Southern Methodist University Law School, I think it was,
Yeah.
about is truth really the most important justification for free speech? And it's social scientific-y, but it's very interesting. You know, how important really is it that more people believe something to be true? Because the more you discuss something, the number of people who think it's true goes up, but so does the number of people who think it isn't true. It's a very interesting article. And then the other thing is this book I'm reading by a historian at University of Pennsylvania named Sophia Rosenfeld, called Democracy and Truth, which is a history of the role of truth in democratic governance, going back to the French Revolution and the Age of the Enlightenment. And if she were here, I dare say she would say, it's never been clear in these kinds of regimes who commands the truth, who owns the truth, what is the truth, how do you arrive at the truth? There's a long history there. Of course, if you asked her, was it ever thus, and there are problems today like they were in the past, she would get very serious and say probably they're more serious now. But I recommend those.
More than probably, she would say they're worse now. I mean, we did run part of that, an essay by her own mouth.
Okay. I stand.
I think she does see a degradation. Obviously, you know, that these arbiters of truth and falsehood, et cetera, have always been in contention politically in America between elites and populist movements and so on. But I think she sees a dangerous degradation that is qualitatively different in our time. Fred, I don't want to step on your article.
No, so it's, I'm not sure the question is just the question of authority. Is there a demand for truth?
Yeah.
That is, authority would matter if and only if there were a considerable demand for truth or accuracy, as opposed to some number of other things. Again, what the psychologists have told us about motivated reasoning would suggest that even with respect to areas in which there are clear factual truths and factual falsities, I don't want to get postmodern here. It's not my style or my preference. But even when there are clear factual truths and factual falsities, people would rather have their own views reinforced. They would rather be entertained. They would rather be a whole bunch of other things. I'm not sure there's a demand for truth. Depressing, but true.
Well, Martha, were you getting ready to jump in some response?
Very quickly. I think I was teaching a class recently on Mill, on chapter 2 of Mill. And we had just read John Milton, and a wonderful essay about John Milton by Vincent Blasi, saying that John Milton had a very clear idea of what the truth was, that this was all, this disputation and free speech was all going in a very clear direction, which was to further define the Reformation's understanding of Christianity. When you get to John Milton, it's not like that anymore. I mean, when you get to John Mill, it's not like that anymore, because it's this kind of contending, this idea that contention and argument and debate is going to arrive at certain kinds of useful, more or less useful truths that will further things or they won't, and that it's an ongoing process and so forth. This is fine with intellectuals. This is fine with academics and people who deal in ideas. Ordinary people, I think, are less comfortable with this idea of endless disputation and endlessly shifting workable truths. I think people want something solid to hold on to. We all need something solid to hold on to in our life. That is, I think, a very, very powerful impulse in the world today. And it's stronger than the intellectual curiosity of most people. And a lot of intellectuals have another way of satisfying that need. It's not as if they didn't have it. So there are things, I guess I'm echoing Fred in a way. Not to put, it sounds terrible to say, but there are things that are more important to people than truth in the sense that we're discussing it.
I would like to I think we could have a good debate starting right there, because I would like to take the contrary. But I see what you're saying, and I could even argue your case like a good lawyer, which I'm not. But I would like to take the contrary side. But that would be the topic for a further discussion, I'm afraid. I think we've run beyond time, and I want to thank, above all, my panelists, the panelists today, Martha and Fred. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
for having. I'm sorry again that it was not live, that we didn't have, which is traditional here, to have a lunch with this, and it always feels more genial to have actual bodies in a physical space together. But
Oh, horrors, we can't have that.
I know, but maybe one day in the future we'll be able to have even this very same panelists together. I know there's a lot more we could go into, but thank you all for being here, and thank you all the participants who signed on. I've seen some of you, including one long lost colleague, Vardana Kanizovich. I waved to her and wish her best. This is a topic that would be of great interest to her. I hope you all are well and stay well, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.